Yeah, on this point, I just wanted to quickly touch on something that's going on in your country right now. Prime Minister Theresa May is forwarding some legislation trying to kind of clamp down on gender-based violence. I want to ask you a little bit about that bill because, you know, it's kind of gone beyond now just kind of enhancing punishment for those who are engaging in physical violence, but now even economic deprivation and psychological abuse. Can you talk a little bit about how that's going to function and what that might do in terms of kind of militating a fight against gender-based violence in the UK?
Well, I think there's all sorts of different types of abuse. There's physical abuse, which I think everybody could recognise, but there's all sorts of other abuse, as you say, emotional abuse. And it's about protection. It's about how can we protect women and girls, and men and boys. This is not just an issue about one sex. It's about the society as a whole. And bringing in legislation so that there is a framework to criminalise that kind of activity, to punish that kind of activity, and ultimately to deter that kind of activity. So we're moving beyond the physical abuse side of it, where we've had legislation for many years in the UK, and into a wider perspective of abuse which can cover a whole range of areas. On education, if I may, we've just been talking about girls out of school. Nigeria has the highest number of children out of school anywhere in the world. So over 11 million children are out of school, and well over half of that number are girls. And as Joy was saying, girls who are educated are less likely to marry early, less likely to have children at a young age, more likely to provide economic benefit to the family. There's a whole range of really quite tangible benefits that come from keeping girls in school, and not just keeping them in school, but giving them a quality education. And one of the things that is coming up at the Commonwealth Summit, you know, we have this Commonwealth Summit in London on the 19th and 20th of April. President Buhari will be in London for that, along with 52 other heads of state and government from all over the Commonwealth, from around the world. One of the key elements of that is getting a commitment from all the leaders, including President Buhari and my own Prime Minister, to commit themselves to 12 years of quality education for every child, girl or boy, across the Commonwealth. I mean, that's a tall order in many ways. But I think unless you set ambitious and stretching targets, then you're not really going to improve or increase the rate of improvement. So we're hoping that President Buhari will sign up to that, along with all the other leaders. That's a high-level commitment. What matters as well, from the political level, you have that high-level commitment, but then at every level, including community level, you take measures such as the measures that Engine are taking to encourage parents to take their children to school, to keep them there, and to understand that there is a really quite tangible economic benefit to the family for girls staying in education.
I'm just wondering, sorry a moment, how impactful are these commitments? You know, for a lot of people, leaders gather, they say fine things, and then come back. Sometimes it's all talk, and nothing is implemented. How demanding, how tasking are these commitments that leaders sign up to? Well,
I think you have to ask the leaders themselves how they're going to implement that. If you sign up to an international commitment, anybody, whether that's a Prime Minister, a President, a Foreign Secretary, signing up to an international commitment should mean something. And it doesn't just mean talk. It doesn't just mean signing a piece of paper and appearing on a group photograph. It means actually going back home and saying, okay, I have signed up to this commitment. What are we going to do in terms of legislation? What are we going to do in terms of the community level engagement? How are we going to support all of these organisations? And there are many of them, community organisations, civil society organisations, who are supporting this broad goal of getting girls into education.
You know, High Commissioner, I'm glad my colleague brought you to where I was actually going to go, which is the issue of domestication, because each nation has its own peculiarities. You have countries where the legislature works pretty well with the executive and they can get things done. You have countries where that doesn't happen. I think Nigeria is now widely known as being a country that does not have that kind of cordiality between the two. Now, if you want to domesticate something like that, what are some of the inputs that some of the developed nations are willing to put in from the Commonwealth to ensure that, for example, funding is there and some of the other kind of tangibles are there to make these things happen?
I think funding is a part of it. There's advocacy as well. But ultimately, whatever overseas aid comes to Nigeria, however many millions of pounds, of dollars comes into Nigeria, it is a drop in the bucket of what Nigeria, A, has itself, and B, should be spending on health, on education, on some of the basic services. And I do think that over decades, this country has underinvested in education. I was recently, just last night, at a launch of a new initiative of women who are actually encouraging other women to stand for politics, called the Beehive Initiative. And I talked about education, I talked about the importance of the government investing in education. So yes, we can help. Yes, we can galvanise. Yes, we can advocate. But what we can't do is run an education system for another country, and especially a country which is, at the end of the day, a wealthy or middle-income country because of all the revenues that it's got coming in. So it's a question of prioritisation. It's a question of how the government is deciding to spend its money and how well the government is spending its money, and making sure that education and health are very, very, very high up. I would say top two priorities of any government. Not for me to dictate the policies of a government, but in general, if you don't invest in your people, you're not investing in your future. And if you look at the demographics of Nigeria, if you look at the probability that Nigeria will have 450 million people by the year 2050, people here talk about the demographic dividend, but there's also a looming demographic disaster if you don't get some of those building blocks right. If you don't have girls going to school at an early age, if you don't have primary health care well established throughout the country, then those 450 million people will not have jobs. They will not be healthy. What's going to happen then to those 450 million people? Yes, of course, it's a huge, huge opportunity. But unless you invest in the future of Nigeria, then you're going to find that demographic dividend will quickly shift to something which is much more serious.
Just wondering then, you've talked about parity. I mean, you want to see a situation where 50% women represent 50% of the population. That's how we should be in Parliament. But then, from your thoughts of democracy, would you really say that democracy supports such a structure? And would we say we haven't achieved parity unless we begin to see 50% of women in Parliament, for instance?
I wouldn't say democracy has failed if you haven't got 50% of women in Parliament. I mean, this is a progression. Let's look at the case of the UK. 2018 is the anniversary, the 100th anniversary of when women got the vote in the UK, the suffragette movement. So in 1918, that was the first time that women got the vote. Now, women have come a very long way in 100 years in the UK. But many women you talk to in the UK, most women you talk to in the UK would say we haven't got parity, we haven't got equality. There are still barriers. If you look at the pay gap, for example, there's been a huge uproar, as you know, in the BBC and other places about the gap between pay for women and pay for men doing the same jobs. So it shows that we have a long way to go. So I'm not advocating that Nigeria should suddenly have 50% women in Parliament by the next Parliament. Of course not. But there needs to be a progression. There needs to be progress. We're talking about press for progress in International Women's Day. And I'm talking about how Nigeria can gradually move, and I hope more than gradually, quickly move up that curve.
Yeah, I'm just looking at that.
And it's a curve that we're still on, by the way. You know, so 32% in the UK is not brilliant.
I'm just wondering, you know, I'm wondering if we'll get to a point where you'll find 60% women and then maybe 40% men, and then men will begin to say, oh no, we want parity. And then the focus might then be on parity instead of the quality of people that we're presenting, for instance, and whether or not the people in those localities want those people to be representing them. I'm just wondering, you know, how do we begin to time?
I'm not misunderstanding that you're saying there isn't enough quality among women in Nigeria to represent the women in Nigeria. I personally, I've met hundreds, thousands of women who are inspiring women in Nigeria, and you know, who can actually do this, who can do this.
Many of them out of power as well.
Well, many of them out of power, many of them frustrated. There's a great book which has just been given. I haven't read yet. I'm sure you know it. Love Does Not Win Elections. Okay, it's about the experience of a woman in